It is almost impossible for an individual who has limited experience with non-ordinary states of consciousness to properly understand that all of that experiential intensity can be simultaneously true and yet incredibly incomplete when it comes to the bigger picture of their spiritual journey and the spiritual essence of what actually exists beyond their perception. To summarize in a single sentence, we keep mistaking experiential power, experiential immediacy for metaphysical completeness. And this is the challenge which I want to confrontingly and uncomfortably try and discuss in this video. A word of warning: if you are in love with your spiritual identity, having had a few mystical experiences, maybe a past life experience, maybe a near-death experience, probably a few powerful dreams along the way, and you're not willing to step outside of that revelation to honestly and genuinely question if that is all that you need to pay attention to, then this video is not for you. We're going to be challenging the idea that mystical revelation and spiritual evolution can proceed from a sense of intuition alone, and couple that concept with a sense of everyday, grounded perspective, which has an honest understanding of how trauma works inside of our bodies and how the pollution of our body, energetically speaking, the fragmentations and ruptures and memories of abuses from the past, can change the way that we receive higher spiritual energy. It's a really interesting topic, and it's something which is very close to my heart and my experience as someone who frequently, not to brag, just as the reality that I experience, frequently experiences powerful, revelatory dreams, often spends time in contemplative states. I've had a near-death experience, I've had spontaneous past life emergences, and I've also spent time reflecting very deeply on the nature of these experiences. So where do we begin? We'll begin, like every video, with today's Inner Work Essential, which is arguably one of the top 10 books in my library. It's Dark Night, Early Dawn by Christopher Bache. Steps to a Deep Ecology of Mind. Why is this the book that we're focusing on? Well, interestingly, this book covers all of the topics that I mentioned. It covers the topics of near-death experiences, past life states, LSD trips, ayahuasca trips, all of those non-ordinary ways of being and seeing and perceiving. But why Christopher Bache is so important is that he is truly attempting to ground this from a sense of rational, pragmatic, everyday holding, rather than being swept away in the mystical fantasy of what I was in my past life and who I could be if all my spiritual grandiosity went unchecked. Let me read you a quote from the book. I actually paraphrased one of the quotes from his book earlier in the introduction, so full credit to Christopher Bache. I've read 3 of his books. This is where you should start. He actually has very interesting ideas about the transpersonal nature of teaching, collective consciousness of a classroom. Fantastic stuff, but not for this episode. I'll read you a quote about this idea of challenging our mystical revelation so that we can actually become better people in this life and not be lost with the bedazzlement of previous lives or the possibility of some kind of soul contract or astrological vision or synchronistic event which completely ungrounds us. Quote from the book: "What becomes available in non-ordinary states is always governed by the consciousness one brings to the encounter. Repeated immersion in these states slowly changes one's baseline consciousness, and as one's baseline changes, new levels of reality open around one." Very proper English there. You get what he's saying, right? And you know it to be true. I'll give you a metaphor. Imagine yourself as a vessel, a pipe or a jug. Probably a pipe. Let's go with a pipe because there's inflow and outflow. Imagine yourself as a pipe. What kind of pipe are you? Some people might imagine a lead pipe. a plastic pipe. Someone who's actually very imaginative and self-loving might imagine themselves as a glass pipe or a crystal pipe. Doesn't matter. But the point I'm trying to illustrate with this idea that there's inflow and outflow is that if spiritual energy or mystical revelation is the inflow from above, and you are the vessel which receives that information, if you turn that perspective like this and take a proper look into your vessel and it's clogged with moss, shit, anxiety in the form of literal death, literal dead creatures inside of that pipe, there's all that grief, there's all that agony clogging that. How much are you going to receive? Very little. And then when you look at the end point, that moment where it's transferred through your consciousness, in this case the physical vessel of your container, how accurate is your perception truly going to be? I'm not trying to attack you, it's just a really confronting truth that I've experienced over and over again. If we're limiting our receptivity to only 20%, 10% or 5% of what's actually emerging in a dream or a non-ordinary state of any kind, and then we're polluting that on the way through with unresolved childhood trauma, we're not going to get very close at all to the reality that's beyond our perception. This is why trauma work, specifically when it comes to healing major childhood abuses or major relational wounds, really is the foundational step for any kind of spiritual developmental journey in a truthful, honest, enduring sense. There's a few problems that come along our way when we don't do this trauma work, something that you maybe have experienced yourself, not to cast shame on this experience or judgment. I've been there definitely a few times, is that when you get your first near-death experience, you get your first, let's give a practical example. Say you have a near-death experience and you almost drown, or you get into a car accident. Often people report that there are experiences of angelic visitation, experiences of sudden knowing, experiences of their soul speaking to them. And they get that profound high, they get that profound sense of expansion. And there's something to do after that revelation. What's so powerful about a near-death experience as opposed to an LSD trip or something like a dream state is that it blows open that pipe, it temporarily clears it out, and you fully experience it. And it's very difficult to ignore the message that comes through. If the message that comes through is received, you're going to change your life quite dramatically. People become very different characters after these kinds of experiences. But what happens if you're not one of the unfortunate or fortunate, depending on your perspective? If you're not one of those people to have a near-death experience, well, maybe you've had a powerful dream. And the dream comes through, but there's still a bit of moss, there's still a bit of clogging there, and you don't fully receive it. You can't translate it perfectly. You're missing out on information, but most importantly of all, you're not actually doing the due diligence to look at the sheer level of clogging inside of your system. And this leaves you open to spiritual grandiosity. It's really sad. It's very clutching. It's very addictive energy in a way. What happens is that you'll receive a bit of dream energy, and if you have a hopeful child inside of you that's running away from a disassociative traumatic childhood experience and escaped into the fantasy land of princes and princesses, fairies and angels who kept you safe during that childhood experience, you're going to take that as confirmation that you're being watched over. You're going to take that as confirmation that you are here for something more. I'm not discrediting that. It could still be the case. But how much of the identity then wraps around that experience and becomes a distorted, Peter Pan-like flight to nowhere? You just unground yourself and root yourself around that experience without knowing how to properly integrate because you haven't received the full picture. The energy that flowed in was a fragment. You got the feeling. You got the feeling of being engaged and being held and being here for something special. But you don't truly receive how to go about doing that. And this is where the spiritual bypassing becomes very significant. Over the course of multiple years, you'll find people who aren't doing the work to ground the visions in, but are merely chasing more visions. It's something I've covered in this series before. Where does this leave us? Well, it leaves you with the kind of person who, when you're talking to them, cannot wait for a narcissistic oversharing about their spiritual intensity under the guise that they're an empathetic, angelic light worker or some other kind of phrase, and they actually pummel you with their revelatory, self-centered, I'm here to save the world, but in this moment I'm actually denying your possibility of relating to me one-to-one, or some other variation, perhaps sharing a lot on Instagram or sharing a lot on some other platform. And they don't truly understand the message of relationship because they're still trying to keep themselves safe. And the spiritual identity is a form of keeping themselves safe. I've been there. I've truly been there. But the next step is to realize that safety in the body can only be re-established through clearing out that pipe. And not only will you be lighter and easier to be around just by yourself, you'll actually have more space both for outflow and for inflow. The spiritual narcissist then becomes a genuinely empathetic spiritual person when they can choose not to share. You may have noticed that in these videos I actually share very little about my personal experiences in this sense, not because I want to hide them from you, but I think they should be used sparingly. Most people want a validation of their experience. Most people, I learned this in one-to-one work especially, most people have gone through their life. People, I'm going to make it more specific, most gifted but troubled people, empathetically attuned, spiritually receptive people, have gone through the majority of their life being consistently disvalidated and alienated from their family structure, their social structure, and their community at large. And they look for other networks of survivors, almost like islands of spiritual refugees who share their experience and they mutually validate. But at what point does that become spiritual mutual masturbation, where you're staying on the island of safety, forgetting the fact that you're fading away, or maybe you're overweight and your body's dying, and you're treating yourself shit, and refusing to return back to the mainland, using the gifts that you've supposedly received, the revelations that have come through, that message of bringing forwards healing or creativity, whatever it may be, bringing it back to the mainland, doing something with it. It becomes impossible if you haven't cleared out your vessel, if the trauma is keeping you afraid, and then spiritual messages start to get distorted in themselves. I haven't even touched on the fact that if you do have an anxious nervous system, if you have a paranoid baseline, you're going to be receiving more visions and dreams of demons than someone who hasn't got that. We forget that when we're dreaming, the brain which does the translating and the heart which does the translating of that energetic receptive conscious experience or unconscious experience, depending on which frame you want to take, if dreams are truly conscious or unconscious. There's a lot of debate on this. We forget that when we're lying there, it's not just happening to us as a blank slate. We're translating with our body and our nervous system. It's why when you're under stress, you get more dreams of violence and death. It's why when you're in a loving state, you get more dreams of lightness and love. Generally speaking, sometimes the opposite can occur. I'm trying to communicate from many different angles the message which Christopher Bache really goes into in this book, which is that every non-ordinary state of consciousness proceeds from the baseline level of consciousness, mentally, emotionally, and physically, that we ground ourselves in. Our essence, in other words, cannot be escaped with a non-ordinary experience. So what do? We do the trauma work. Specifically, the trauma work of healing the dissociative pattern to return back into our bodies, going through that grief period where we realize just how much gunk and how much fragmentation and how much beheading that we've endured energetically, and releasing those patterns so that we can receive and pour out from a more genuine, authentic, spiritually powerful place. How are we going to do that? Well, I recommend that you actually click on over to the next video, where we're going to be covering Trauma and the Soul by William Blake. It's a beautiful book. I've just got a delivery of a new book, so I'm actually going to leave it there. I'll see you on that video.